Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. It is an honor to be amongst you at this inaugural Global Gender Summit, especially as it comes just 1 month before the SDGs' 5th year anniversary. Unfortunately, COVID-19 prevents us from meeting in person altogether. But the virus that has changed our society so much this year is actually more deeply connected to the topic of gender equality and women in STEM than you may first realize. Let me tell you a bit more about what I mean. Have any of you heard of a woman named June Almeida? She's a very important virologist, a pioneer actually in virus imaging, identification, and diagnosis. She was born in 1930 in Scotland, but had to drop out of school at the age of 16. She was a top student but could not financially afford to continue. Instead, she found a job as a low-level lab technician examining cells and tissues under a microscope. In her mid-20s, June moved to Toronto with her husband and took on a new job as an electron microscopy technician. Now remember, she had only worked before as a basic lab technician and lacked formal education and training in this field. This was also the 1950s, so detecting virus in tissue samples was painstaking work. Examining a single sample could take hours. But that is what set June apart. Not only did she have exceptional attention to detail, patience, and persistence, but she also exercised the right preparations every time. Her skills and qualities soon became apparent and ultimately led her to something that nobody had ever seen before, 1964. Yet, it is something that we all know well today, the coronavirus. By using new techniques and methods, June pushed the envelope in electron microscopy and exceeded all expectations by discovering the first human coronavirus particles. Along the way, she also proved many of her male skeptics and colleagues wrong. And in the years after, June continued to make her mark in the scientific world by capturing more breakthroughs, such as seeing the first image of the rubella virus and identifying the virus structure that causes hepatitis B. Safe to say, these are all extraordinary and laudable discoveries. But if not for COVID-19, it's likely that we would not have heard of June at all. And more importantly, June is only one of many remarkable women whose efforts have changed the world yet remain largely unrecognized. Despite recent promising developments, many gender inequalities still exist in science, both within our ecosystem and in our actual research practices. For one, there are currently less than 30% of researchers worldwide that are women. Even with evidence that gender diversity drives productivity and innovation, the reality is that female scientists on average are still underrepresented at senior levels, receive less grant money, and promoted more slowly, and are allocated fewer resources for research than their male counterparts. In terms of publishing, women researchers around the world also author fewer articles than men, though we see that this gap is slowly narrowing. From 1999 to 2003, women authors made up 29% of the global active author population. Now fast forward 15 years to 2014 and 2018, and the number of women authors has risen to 38%. But it is important to note that these aggregate numbers hide considerable disciplinary and country-level differences. For example, when looking at math-related publications from 2014 to 2018, American women accounted for only 16% of the country's active authors, whereas Argentinian women accounted for 33% of its active authors over the same period. On the other hand, the gender breakdown in life and health science publications are closer to parity. In fact, subjects like nursing even reveal a predominance of women authors. From 2014 to 2018, women in the EU made up 63% of active authors, and in Australia, this number even reached as high as 71%. While there are considerable improvements, male and female researchers still face different realities, and such differences stem from traditional gender stereotypes perpetuated by our social and environmental factors. No doubt, growing up in such settings have influenced the coming generations of women. We see this clearly in the distribution of female higher education students studying STEM, which sits globally at about 30% only. And with the current leaky pipeline of talented women, an even even a smaller percentage will end up going into STEM-related fields upon graduation. In fact, an OECD study actually found that at just 15 years of age, young boys are already more than twice as likely as girls to expect to grow up and work in science or engineering fields, and 12 times as likely as girls to expect to grow up and work in IT fields. What's more is that the same study's aptitude tests revealed similar performance results between these boys and girls. So the only difference was that the girls claimed to have less confidence in their abilities. So without equitable support from stakeholders like us, ambitious and capable young girls will continue to drop out of STEM, and this will negatively affect societal advancement. As leaders, we must address these glaring imbalances and make STEM much more welcoming and inclusive for female students and researchers. But our work doesn't just stop here. We must also tackle the gender inequalities and biases that exist in research itself. These affect the broader female demographic and can lead to a real harm. Let's take an example. Women's health has suffered historically because their bodies are less understood than those of men. To date, many studies have failed to account for sex and gender differences and tend to have an unequal representation of women at important clinical trials. Results or recommendations are based primarily on findings from the male body, yet generalized to apply to both men and women. As one can imagine, such biased practices have led to misdiagnosis and adverse consequences for women around the world. In a similar way, female drivers are faced with graver dangers due to male-focused testing. Even though researchers discovered 40 years ago that male and female bodies react differently in crashes, the vast majority of auto safety testing in the US today is still designed to address the average 76 kilogram, 1 meter 77 centimeters tall male. These are only a few samples of how harmful gender bias in research can be. If we are to create a more sustainable future, correcting such inequalities must be at the top of our agenda. At Elsevier, we recognize our responsibility in STEM community and hope to use our capabilities to better inform, guide, and enable leaders like you to take action. So enough about telling you about problems. In the rest of my talk today, I'd like to share 3 specific ways in which we at Elsevier are promoting greater gender diversity. We're talking about actions. By leading initiatives to make publishing and research practices more equitable, by leveraging data analytics to drive actionable insights, and by engaging in global partnerships. So let me tell you a little bit more about each of these, starting with our Elsevier-led industry initiatives. When the SDGs were first adopted 5 years ago, Elsevier moved quickly to put together an internal trans-business gender working group. The goal was to identify key areas where publishing and research should be more equitable and establish a framework of best policies that other organizations could emulate. One of the key areas identified by the group is gender diversity amongst reviewers, editors, and editorial staff. A low representation of women throughout the publishing process can reduce the diversity of ideas or perspectives, and subsequently hampering the sharing of knowledge and advancement of science. At Elsevier, we feel strongly about increasing female presence in our journals and through our gender working groups interventions have seen tangible actions take place. Let's look at The Lancet, an Elsevier premier journal. It adopted a diversity pledge last August to increase the representation of women and people of color among its editorial advisors, peer reviewers, and authors. On top of that, it adopted a no all-male panel policy, in which no Lancet editor will serve as a panelist if there are no women on the panel. These encouraging changes inspire us to expand on our efforts and unlock the full potential of our STEM community. So 5 months ago, we launched the Elsevier Inclusion and Diversity Board. With 9 influential non-Elsevier figures, the board's mission is to address gender disparities across the entire industry, working with academics, governments, funders, and publishers alike. Dr. Elizabeth Pulitzer, the wonderful founder of Gender Summit, is actually one of our members and can speak to the board's breadth of initiatives. It implements pilot programs, it introduces guidance policies, and it shares best practices with relevant industry stakeholders. Of course, it is important for each of us here to keep our foot on the gas, but the challenge of attaining gender parity is highly complex. It's our hope that these Elsevier-led initiatives act as powerful conveners of this industry, uniting us to create meaningful impacts in STEM and motivating us to pursue further advancements to come. A second way that Elsevier is fighting gender inequality is by leveraging our expertise in data science and analytics. Although we are still often thought of as a print publisher, the truth is that Elsevier is now predominantly a technology-driven analytics provider. And by combining our enormous amount of content and networks with sophisticated computing expertise, Elsevier has positioned itself as a data science company, harnessing the power of analytics to expose gaps and areas of improvement. One such example of how we're using data analytics to tackle gender disparity is through our research reports. Using an evidence-based approach that taps into our Scopus database of over 70 million documents, we are able to integrate new indicators and bibliometrics that reflect the status of gender equality around us. In 2018, we contributed such analytical expertise to the European Commission's She Figures publication. This compared gender balance in research and innovation at the pan-European level. And since 2015, Elsevier has used our own data and information solutions to publish gender reports. Our third and most recent report was just released this past March and highlights how gender impacts researchers' participation, its footprint, career progression, its collaborations, and more. Through our analytics, we have found even the most nuanced differences between male and female researchers. And recently, we've deployed our data and analytics on a novel sex and gender mapping project. My colleague Holly is presenting on this topic in more detail in Theme 6. But as a quick preview, let me share with you that Elsevier has applied an innovative keyword search approach and mapping method to paint each SDG from a gender perspective. An example of our finding is that only 2% of 2018's publications related to SDG 9, which is the industry innovation infrastructure, only 2% factored in sex and/or gender into their research. As we already know, gender bias can be detrimental, and uncovering data like these can shine a light on where we need to urgently improve. Now, while Elsevier's initiatives and data analytics are important to advancing gender equality, they alone are not enough to drive change across STEM industry. This is where the final piece of our puzzle comes in, the global partnerships. By engaging with stakeholders like you around the world, we can merge our individual expertise and resources to achieve the shared goal of gender equality. At Elsevier, several of our partnerships are created via the Elsevier Foundation, which is now in its 15th year of advancing diversity in science. Just last year, we teamed up with Girls Inc. of New York City to introduce a course that prepares low-income and underserved girls to study data analytics in high school. Our goal is to help these girls foster a stronger interest in data analytics and increase overall confidence in their abilities. Hopefully, more and more partnerships like that will take place in the near future. In fact, a few might even materialize from this very event today. Since 2011, Elsevier has had a prominent and long-standing partnership with the Gender Summit. We look forward to every summit because they're not just regular events or conferences. Instead, they're platforms for change. They always produce tangible and measurable outcomes. A few years ago, I attended the first ever APAC Gender Summit right here in Seoul, and we came out of it with a formal declaration that called on policymakers to promote gender research and also a thorough report on gender-based innovation for the UN SDGs. This year, I'm optimistic that our first ever Global Gender Summit will produce similarly compelling results. Despite our unusual circumstances, this event can be and will be a catalyst for change. Now more than ever, we must reach out. We must connect, and we must work together. By way of solidarity, close collaboration, and partnerships, we can become a much more powerful force in advancing gender equality. It's clear that there is a jagged road ahead before we reach gender parity in STEM. But as key leaders in the industry, we have the responsibility to smooth that path. One of my favorite parts about the virologist June Almeida's story is that she never stopped contributing to science. She just couldn't stay away. After retiring, she became a yoga teacher and even traded antiques for a bit. But none of that satisfied her the way scientific research and discovery did. So she actually came back to STEM and worked as an advisor in London's St. Thomas Hospital until her passing, the very same place she discovered the coronavirus decades ago. If anything, June Almeida's story shows us that science is powerful, and having the means and support to pursue that is life-changing. So let's help more women like June feel included. Let's make our community and our research more equitable. And finally, let's harness our initiatives, our analytics, and our partnerships to advance human progress together. Thank you very much.